Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The year 1918 marked the beginning of a challenging year for the world. World War I had taken billions of lives, futures, and hopes. Much of Europe had been devastated, military arsenals and cities reduced to rubble. The pain of the war had left deep scars both among soldiers who fought on the front lines and the women who had lost loved ones at home. The entire world was struggling to survive amidst a great catastrophe. People, fatigued and fearful of the war, were hoping for its end. However, beneath the shadow of the war, another catastrophe was rapidly approaching. An unnoticed but far deadlier enemy, a disease. A virus. Just a few years after the outbreak of World War I, in a military hospital in Kansas, an incident involving a 25-year-old American soldier who suddenly developed symptoms of a severe cold and cough would mark the beginning of a catastrophe that would deeply shake the entire world. Everything started when an ordinary soldier in a military hospital in Kansas suddenly fell ill, showing symptoms of severe coughing, dizziness, high fever, and muscle aches. Initially, doctors believed it was just a common cold. However, within a week the disease spread rapidly. Coupled with the chaotic war environment, it became impossible to control the spread of the disease. In the hellish conditions of the war, soldiers who could hardly move were quickly infected by this contagious flu. This flu, which was not an ordinary virus, soon affected not only Kansas, but all of America. From small towns in the Midwest to the Atlantic coast, every city, town, and village was unknowingly, if not hastily, struck by the disease. Furthermore, this flu was not an ordinary virus. The causes of the 1918 Spanish flu are still not fully understood, but the first cases are believed to have spread rapidly due to the cramped conditions of soldiers and the war environment. In those years, the world was living in an atmosphere of brutality created by the war, providing the perfect environment for the virus to travel quickly. A patient's cough in a military hospital would create a deadly impact in a city. A city's sick person would infect a village, and a sick person in a village would cause death on another continent. Large crowds significantly contributed to the rapid spread of the disease. Public transportation, schools, hospitals, and even hotels became hotspots for the rapid transmission of the virus. The disease spread quickly in nearly every country. However, everyone's mind was on the war, its end, and finally on freedom. The disease silently progressed, unnoticed, and unexpectedly. People were infecting each other by shaking hands, coughing, and eating together every day. At first, the disease primarily affected American soldiers whose bodies had been weakened by the hardships of war. However, as time passed, the disease spread to more people, affecting individuals of all ages and backgrounds. In some regions of America, the disease spread so quickly that people could not even comprehend when or how death would strike. The rapid spread of the disease led to the collapse of healthcare systems. Doctors struggled to care for patients, and nurses were exhausted from overwork. Physicians tried to use every kind of medication at their disposal, but the speed with which the flu virus spread made medical interventions inadequate. The outbreak of the disease in America showed the world just how deadly this disease was. In many cities, people struggled with fear while trying to cope with the disease, and the truth about the illness was kept hidden from the public. However, no matter how much it was hidden, the disease continued to spread rapidly to every village, town, and city. Without realizing what was happening, death notices began to arrive every day. While the world was nearing the end of the war, another disaster, a far more dangerous enemy, was attacking the entire population and society. No one had predicted that the Spanish flu would transform into a global catastrophe after the war. When the first symptoms of the Spanish flu began to spread from Kansas, no power in the world could have foreseen that it would turn into such a massive disaster. In the early months of 1918, the virus had only affected the interior of America and military hospitals, where weary soldiers were stationed. However, this flu spread without boundaries and quickly reached Europe, Asia, Africa, and even Australia. Now the world, still exhausted from the brutal war, was facing another fear: a terrifying flu pandemic that was rapidly engulfing the entire planet. Before spreading to America, the virus had already reached Europe. On the European fronts of World War I, the flu quickly spread among soldiers and civilians, turning into a situation where the number of patients and deaths increased at a frightening pace. European cities, still bearing the scars of war, were left defenseless against the flu, with their weak and exhausted populations. In major cities like Paris, London, Madrid, Berlin, and Rome, the disease took hold of people day and night. In addition to the usual symptoms of cough and fever, it led to death with severe headaches and muscle pains. In many European countries, the disease spread so rapidly that cities were put under quarantine. Governments banned people from going outside, and health warnings were issued everywhere. Schools were closed, factories began to shut down one by one, and there was not enough equipment and personnel to treat patients. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers struggled to keep up with the rising number of patients, continuing to fight the virus at the risk of their own health. Europe, still reeling from the devastation of war, was now threatened by the flu pandemic. The exhausted population, still reeling from the last years of the war, was left to face another deadly virus. The arrival of the Spanish flu in Europe signaled the global spread of the disease. The flu rapidly crossed the Atlantic, reaching America's east coast and then spreading across the entire continent. But this pandemic didn't only affect the developed societies of the West. People in Asia, Africa, and remote villages also suffered from this deadly virus. Many African countries witnessed an increase in death rates due to the flu. In India, especially in major cities, the outbreak spread with horrifying speed. The British colonial government's delayed response in India only made the death toll rise even more. However, at first no one fully understood the magnitude of this global disaster. People did not fully grasp what the disease was. The flu spread faster in large crowds, but no one was aware of it. In many cities, crowds gathered. In the streets, people ate together, and in trains, ships, and even on the battlefield, they stood close to each other. The disease continued to spread rapidly in every place where people congregated. Soldiers who were either in or near the war zones became virus carriers, transporting the disease from one place to another. Many soldiers, after falling ill, were sent back home, infecting their family members who were waiting for them. The rapidly spreading flu shook cities, villages, and towns one by one. On farms and factories, in schools, and in the streets, people coughed and shivered as they fought the illness. Pharmacies ran out of medicines, and hospitals overflowed with patients. Many local governments struggled to contain the scale of the outbreak. In America, particularly in major cities like New York and San Francisco, the flu spread at a terrifying pace. The number of patients not only increased, but the death toll also rose quickly during the pandemic. Many families lost loved ones to the disease. The presence of the disease was felt in every corner of the cities. People became hesitant to gather outside. Families shut themselves in their homes and avoided contact with each other. The disease primarily targeted those with weak immune systems, the elderly, and children. In poor neighborhoods and areas devastated by war, death rates were significantly higher. The fear caused by the virus affected people's daily lives. Most countries began implementing quarantines to control the outbreak. Schools were closed, trade halted, and travel restrictions were imposed. Governments took various measures to try to prevent the virus from spreading further. But no matter what measures were taken, the deadly flu continued to affect more and more people with each passing day. Healthcare systems were collapsing, and the number of patients was increasing day by day. In many countries, there was a shortage of medical supplies and medicine. Healthcare workers, exhausted and worn out, continued their battle against the disease. But even doctors and nurses were too weak to overcome the disease. During this period of rapid spread of the Spanish flu, the world had nearly gone silent. Everything that was needed had suddenly disappeared. The streets echoed with the silent footsteps of death, and cities seemed deserted. As the world was being dragged into a catastrophe, people were only thinking about what they needed to do to survive. By the end of 1918, World War I finally came to an end. In the war-torn cities and villages of Europe, life was about to begin anew. However, the sense of freedom that came after the end of the war was unfortunately overshadowed by the horror of the Spanish flu. While humanity was trying to heal the wounds of the war, it was now confronted with the dark face of another disaster. On one side, weary people emerging from the war, and on the other, a deadly flu pandemic. With the end of the war, as armies returned home, there was joy and hope in many countries. However, this joy quickly vanished as a new disaster loomed. The Spanish flu spread rapidly in the countries where the war had ended, and the death toll rose every day. While the war had already claimed millions of lives, now this flu pandemic threatened millions more. People expecting to recover after the war now faced the deadly virus, which spared no one, affecting people of all ages, classes, and nationalities. The traumas and psychological devastation caused by the war, combined with the flu pandemic, marked one of the darkest periods in world history. In many countries, the measures taken to combat the disease were insufficient, and people were not only afraid of the flu, but also of this new threat that emerged after the war. In many cities, as the death toll rose, healthcare workers were exhausted, doctors and nurses were overwhelmed. Healthcare systems collapsed and hospitals overflowed. Not only had the war taken lives, but now the number of deaths from the flu was also rapidly increasing. The Spanish flu specifically targeted people with weakened immune systems. The elderly and children were among the victims, and even those who had survived the war found themselves helpless in the face of the flu. Moreover, there was no difference between the rich and the poor. The disease attacked people from all classes, sparing no one. Many wealthy families lost children to the disease. In poor neighborhoods, deaths skyrocketed. Poverty and inadequate healthcare were major barriers to combating the illness. In the aftermath of the war, many governments issued health warnings to inform the public and prevent the spread of the disease. However, the flu spread so rapidly that authorities were unable to stop it. Schools, churches, public buildings, and factories closed one by one. The streets emptied, and a deathly silence overtook the cities. In many countries, people were forced to stay in their homes to prevent the further spread of the virus. Homes became places where death loomed at all times. People kept their distance to avoid contact, and the sick were left alone in their rooms. In America, the greatest impact of the outbreak was felt in large cities. In New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and other major cities, the disease continued to spread rapidly. The streets piled up with bodies, and there were so few people left to conduct funerals. The number of patients grew so high that there weren't even enough people to carry out the burials. Mayors and government officials declared quarantines to protect the public from the effects of the disease. But these measures were not enough to stop the spread of the pandemic. In every city, the number of patients increased rapidly, and death rates rose dramatically. As many families mourned the loss of their loved ones, those who remained were also faced with death. Healthcare workers risked their lives in the battle against the illness. Some doctors hesitated to come into contact with infected patients, while others bravely continued to treat them. But soon, healthcare workers themselves contracted the disease and began to die. In many cities, the number of doctors dwindled, and the remaining healthcare workers were exhausted. The Spanish flu was not only a physical illness, but also a psychological catastrophe that deeply affected people's mental health. People who lost their loved ones had to face the cold, merciless face of death. Their lives were shattered. Families, upon losing their patients, couldn't even say their final goodbyes. The entire world was struck by a disaster, and social structures were undergoing a great trial. The war had ended, but the world was still fighting another enemy. The destruction caused by the Spanish flu deeply shook people, forcing societies to undergo significant change. After the devastation of the war, the recovery that people needed to restart was delayed due to the pandemic. Both psychologically and physically, the world found itself in a deadlock. Disease and death dragged people into a world that felt abandoned. This disaster not only affected individual lives but left lasting marks on entire societies and international relations, impacting all of humanity. The year 1918 witnessed one of the most devastating and chaotic times in world history. World War I had ended, but the people, still unable to recover from the traumas of war, were now confronted with the terrifying effects of the Spanish flu. The disease had left people facing death and helplessness. Cities, villages, and towns had turned into ruins. Yet amidst this chaos, there were those who survived. They were brave souls, searching for a glimmer of hope for life, fighting to survive amid the war and the disease. As the effects of the flu pandemic rapidly grew, societies around the world were suddenly living in fear, anxiety, and insecurity. Many people were unable to leave their homes, forced into quarantine. The streets were empty and major cities were practically abandoned. Families had to stay apart to protect their children and the elderly, and within homes, a sense of sorrow and loneliness prevailed. Governments declared quarantines, but these measures were insufficient to stop the spread of the disease. Masks, antiseptics, and social distancing recommendations could not halt the virus. Many families had lost their loved ones to the flu. After the devastating impact of the war, people who had been waiting to find peace in their homes now had to wait for the cold death of the flu. Death was not just a word, but an ever-present reality. Death was waiting in patient beds, in the streets, homes, hospitals, and schools. Every corner, every home, every person was being tested by death. Those who managed to survive had to find a way to continue their existence in the midst of this chaos, because the disease was not only physically devastating but also psychologically destructive. Many people could not accept the loss of their loved ones due to the impact of the illness. Family members, neighbors, and friends were disappearing, one by one, and after fighting the disease for days, people were trying to support each other in order to survive. However, many had survived the illness. On one hand, there was a deadly flu pandemic, and on the other, people struggling for survival. The survivors were trying to protect the remaining members of their families while also striving to rebuild society. These people were struggling to survive with hope in a world torn apart by both war and disease. The public was placed under quarantine, at every corner where the virus spread, not knowing what to do. As governments tried to prevent the disease from spreading, social life faced a massive collapse. The streets were deserted, and markets and shops were closed. People were struggling to find food and medicine. Many families were racing against each other to find food. Poverty, combined with the disease, made survival even harder for the remaining people. After the war, the economic depression and unemployment affected many families. The Spanish flu deepened the economic collapse, making societies even more vulnerable. People couldn't find work. Factories were closing down and small businesses were unable to open their shops. In many cities, unemployed people had lost their loved ones to the disease while the survivors were battling hunger and poverty. However, despite all the hardship, the survivors were still searching for a glimmer of hope. Many families clung to each other to survive. Neighborly relations became more important in the fight against the disease. People mobilized to help one another. In some regions, people worked day and night to deliver food and medicine to each other. Many towns and villages came together to fight collectively. Many communities became more connected in their struggle to survive. Facing loneliness, the pain of illness, and death, people tried to stand tall again by supporting each other. The survivors were undergoing a destructive process, both physically and psychologically. The disease affected people's minds as well, questioning not only their bodies but their souls. Many people, after losing their loved ones, had in a sense lost their reason for survival. However, the survivors were trying to find a glimmer of hope by holding on to each other. Many healthcare workers risked their lives in the fight against the disease. As hospitals were overcrowded with patients, doctors and nurses were exhausted. Yet they continued their struggle. Many doctors contracted the disease and passed away. But the surviving doctors continued to fight with all their might to help others. On the other hand, some people who survived the illness developed immunity and were among the survivors in the later stages of the disease. However, the flu virus spread so rapidly that in some areas, even those who had gained immunity were faced with death when they encountered the disease. The Spanish flu was not only a physical illness, but also a period that tested a society, culture, and the history of humanity. The survivors had to give hope to both themselves and each other in order to rise again after a disaster. While many people tried to accept their losses, others fought to rebuild society. Amidst the chaos, those who survived, while face to face with death, still carried a glimmer of hope for life. Facing the destructive effects of both war and disease, these people maintained their belief in the power of solidarity even in tough times, holding on to the hope that they would one day emerge from this dark period. The survivors helped each other, discovering the strength in staying united to emerge stronger from the disaster. The year 1919 was born under the shadow of catastrophe. World War I had ended, and people had begun to nurture long-awaited hopes for peace. However, peace arrived with sickness, destruction, and death. The world, not only recovering from war but also from the devastating consequences of a pandemic, was deeply scarred by the Spanish flu. All around the world, death approached rapidly, and people's eyes and hearts were filled with sorrow. Poverty, unemployment, and the internal collapse of societies became an unavoidable fate for even the survivors of the disaster. As the war neared its end, there was a belief that a time of relief had come for the world. However, immediately afterward, the Spanish flu swept across the globe like a tsunami. The virus spread at an unexpected speed. From Europe to America, Asia to Africa, every continent, every country was engaged in a battle against this deadly pandemic. Life in poor neighborhoods became even more difficult, and even the wealthy districts could not escape the grip of the flu. Neither the wealthy neighborhoods of cities nor the poor in rural areas could escape the pandemic's hold. The disease affected people of all ages and social classes, suddenly taking their lives. In both America and Europe, death rates reached alarming levels. The lack of medical infrastructure and inadequate healthcare services worsened the disaster. Corpses piled up in the streets and efforts were made to organize the funerals. Inside homes, patients were facing death alone. People were burying their dead not only in the streets, but also within their own homes. The survivors could feel the cold breath of death, losing their loved ones one by one. The war had ended, but the battle with the virus continued. The disease spread so rapidly that governments had difficulty tracking which city or region it had reached. In many cities, it became impossible for patients to even reach hospitals. Everyone had confined themselves to their homes, and schools and workplaces were shut down. Although many countries tried to hide the disease in panic, the truth could not be hidden. The death toll grew with each passing day. The Spanish flu was not just an epidemic, but rather a revolution that turned the world's order upside down. Following the physical destruction of war, the flu virus created a global psychological collapse. People not only lost their physical health, but were also overwhelmed by the grief of losing their loved ones. The war had already shattered many souls. The brutality and losses of the war had left permanent scars on many families' hearts. And now this emotional void was deepened by the Spanish flu. People who had lost their loved ones didn't know what to do with their dead. Funerals had ceased to be a brief ritual and had become an obligation. The disease created a heavy burden, not only on physical health but also on emotional and mental health. The losses affected every part of society. Particularly, when children lost their loved ones, they developed a great fear of life. Many families fought to secure their children's futures, but this meant engaging in an even greater battle with the virus. The disease had not only brought death, but had also disrupted the social fabric of societies. In many cities, people had to stay apart. Families could not approach one another due to the disease, and neighbors could not see each other. Weddings, funerals, births, every social ritual and event was postponed. Indeed, people who once gathered in shared living spaces now only looked at each other through the lens of death and fear. Across the world, with the spread of the disease, another catastrophe emerged: economic collapse. The post-war period had already seen weak economies, but the flu pandemic deepened this collapse. Many countries affected by both the war and the epidemic began to face severe economic difficulties. Production ceased, factories closed, and workplaces crumbled. Unemployment rates rose across every sector, and great waves of poverty spread among farmers and workers. Many people could not find work to support themselves, businesses shut down, and people struggled with unemployment. The poor fought against both disease and poverty. But the situation was little different for the wealthy class. The virus also affected the rich in the same way. However, this class was able to alleviate the struggle for survival a little more due to their financial power. The wealthy had access to private treatment options and the necessary medicines and care to fight the disease. However, this further deepened societal inequalities. Although many governments tried to improve the economic conditions of the people, the collapse of healthcare systems and the speed of the virus's spread rendered these efforts futile. With the impact of the Spanish flu, societies attempted to rebuild while the world was in search of a new identity after a catastrophe. The destructive effects of war and disease had opened the doors to a new era. Governments and scientists began to make new plans to strengthen healthcare systems and increase public health measures. Medical research rapidly increased, vaccines were developed, and investments in public health were made. However, these improvements came too late to heal the wounds of the catastrophe. The world spent a long time trying to recover from both disasters. People, without forgetting the pains of the past, gradually worked to build a stronger society and rise again. The Spanish flu left deep scars in human history, claimed many lives, but also made people more resilient and more conscious. What remained from the collapsed societies was not just hope, but also the desire to create a better world and the lessons learned. After the dark period of 1918 and 1919, the world faced deep wounds, lost dreams, and abandoned cities. The devastating effects of the Spanish flu were more than just an epidemic. They left unforgettable marks on a period of history. This deadly pandemic had a significant impact not only on lives but also on people's societies, families, beliefs, and futures. The disease caused the death of 50 million people worldwide, leaving a deep impact on social structures, economic balances, and psychological resilience. The effects of the Spanish flu were very apparent in the early years of the 20th century. World War I, with its destructive effects and the losses of millions of soldiers and civilians, symbolized the beginning of a dark period for the world. However, nothing could compare to the marks left by a pandemic that spread at such a rapid pace and paralyzed the world with its deadly effects. People did not consider the Spanish flu to be just an epidemic. For them, it was an indescribable catastrophe. Every day, more and more people became ill and could not leave their homes. Many families lost their loved ones one by one, and homes were filled with the echoes of the dead. The impact of the flu was not only physical, but also deeply affected the emotional and psychological fabric of society. During a time when death could come so close and so sharply at any moment, all beliefs about human life were questioned. This terrifying period laid the foundations for both a catastrophe and a rebirth. Many people, in the shadow of losing their loved ones and their struggle for survival, lived with dreams of building a healthier society. But the immense destruction caused by the Spanish flu forced them not only to reshape today, but also to reconsider the future. After the impact of the Spanish flu, health systems around the world had to undergo a major transformation. The existing shortcomings in healthcare infrastructure became more pronounced with the rapid spread of the pandemic. Many governments were slow to respond to the magnitude of the catastrophe, leading to the loss of lives worldwide. However, this destructive process also marked the beginning of a transformation. Following the deep scars left by the flu, medical research gained momentum. Scientists who survived the effects of the Spanish flu took action to better prepare for such pandemics. New treatment methods, vaccines, and radical improvements to healthcare systems were developed. This process ensured that the necessary steps were taken to make the world's healthcare systems more resilient. After 1919, governments and health institutions began making significant investments to build a stronger infrastructure. Budgets for health research increased, new medical devices were produced, and epidemiological studies became more detailed. The world united in a collective effort to prevent such a catastrophe in the future. Research on vaccine production and disease prevention accelerated, and the development of medical science played an important role in this process. Many countries faced serious economic difficulties after the war, compounded by the impact of the flu. Factories closed, workplaces collapsed, and sources of income dwindled. This situation led to larger economic crises, particularly in developing countries. Many people lost their jobs and entered a difficult struggle to support their families. The destructive impact of the flu increased unemployment rates worldwide, deeply affecting all segments of society. However, over time, steps toward economic recovery began to be taken. Investments in the healthcare sector and the expansion of treatment options helped to increase employment and accelerate economic revival. In many countries, large development plans were implemented to compensate for the financial losses caused by the war and the pandemic. During this period, governments not only aimed for economic growth, but also developed projects to improve the social welfare and quality of life of their citizens. The understanding of helping one another and the spirit of solidarity played a critical role in the rebuilding of societies. The greatest impact of the Spanish flu was seen in the social structures of societies. People, still grieving the loss of their loved ones, felt the sense of community and mutual aid stronger than ever in this period of disease and destruction. Many not only fought the illness but also carried a responsibility to rebuild their societies. After the flu, the desire for more equal and just societies grew. Inequalities in health and education became more visible. Women, having been affected by the war and the pandemic, began to demand more power and changes in the social structure. The women's movement rapidly gained strength in many countries, and significant steps toward gender equality began to be taken. The traces left by the flu allowed people to reshape their lives after the war and build more just and resilient societies. As they moved past their losses, challenges, and pains, they began to focus on leaving stronger foundations for future generations. The Spanish flu, claiming the lives of 50 million people, had disappeared from the stage of history. However, the marks it left continued to deeply affect people, social structures, healthcare systems, and economic relationships for a century. People, with the lessons learned from this great disaster, more deeply understood the importance of living together and protecting one another. While scientists worked to extend human life through medical research, social structures became more resilient. The Spanish flu was a turning point for humanity. The disaster of that time led to a series of measures, actions, and reforms that would make people stronger in the years to come. This process was not only a rebirth after an epidemic, but also a reshaping of people's lives, societies, and the world, with the lessons learned from the catastrophe. These lessons allowed future generations to live in a healthier, more cooperative, and more resilient world.